Well, clearly, as you can tell from my accent, I was born in England. In fact, I was born in the wonderful county of Yorkshire. I always enjoyed travelling, always wanted, two things in life I wanted to do was to travel and to write. So I was writing all the time, not getting much published except when I was a newspaper reporter. Of course, I was writing every day, but I was also trying to write fiction on the side in the evenings and weekends. And after I finished with the newspaper, I decided to come to Canada to visit my sister, who had already emigrated here. I already knew at the age of about 7 or 8 that I didn't want to live in England. The weather was just awful, and there was, at that time in Yorkshire, everything was in decline. Coal industry, shipbuilding, textiles, clothing, cotton, wool. The city I was brought up in was famous for wool. In fact, they always boasted that about 90-something% of all the wool transactions in the world went through Bradford, either by actually shipping the wool there to be dyed and spun into cloth or woven into cloth, or was for insurance or forwarding and all sorts of brokering, all sorts of things. But everything in the 70s in the north of England was in decline, and I just wanted out. And there was also a nasty undercurrent of racism, and I just wanted out. My sister had come here, to Canada. I had met a lot of Canadians, always been very impressed, and I thought, well, I'll go visit my sister. So I flew into New York and then took the bus up to Toronto. At that time, this is in the late 70s, Toronto was not the cosmopolitan city it is now, the international city it is now. It was, they used to call it Cowtown, and that was a pretty good description, really. From Toronto, I then hitchhiked across Canada, and I remember being in the north of Ontario, on the Trans-Canada Highway, and getting a ride with a truck driver, high up in the cab, and the sun setting. And the sun is setting over the pine forest, and you can see the far horizon. And I thought, this is the land for me. And I visited my sister, had a great time, met her husband, then went back to England, and I applied for immigration. And I told my parents, if they'll take me, I'm moving to Canada. And they looked at me and said, well, don't you want to discuss this? And I just looked blankly at them and said, what is there to discuss? If they'll take me, I'm going. And eventually they did did take me, and I got the landing papers. But of course, there was a long gap while all the paperwork was done. So in that gap, I obviously needed money. As an immigrant, I needed as much money as I could put together. So I got a job at Rowntree's making KitKat bars. And there's a kind of funny story about how I got the job. Good manners are their own reward, of course. But on this occasion, it also paid extra dividends, because I went to the employment office at Rowntree's in Yorkshire. And as I approached the door, there was a young lady behind me. And of course, I opened the door and allowed her to go in first. So she got to the counter first, and she said, I'd like to apply for a job. And they said, sure. Do you live in York? And she said, no, but as soon as I get a job, I'll move here. And so the person behind the counter said, well, I'm sorry, but we can't employ people who don't already live in York. It was one of the rules of the company. So, she was turned away. So when I got to the counter, and I said, I would like to get a job, please. And they said, sure. Do you live in York? I immediately said, of course, yes, I live in, 123 Apple Street. And they wrote it all down, and I got the job. Then I moved to York. Found somewhere to live. Then I went back a couple of weeks later. Oh, I've moved from 123 Apple Street, and then gave my new address. But if I hadn't allowed the lady to go in first, I would have been refused, and I wouldn't have had the job. And I worked at Rowntree's for about 6 months. We made something like 1.2 million KitKat bars a day. And I worked 6 days a week, 5 days on the belts, and then the 6th day was cleaning. And there was extra money for that. It was a great place to work. The work was unbelievably boring, but we were we were well paid. Conditions were good. The crew I worked with were fun. It was a little bit, if you forgot to take your meal with you and you're working the night shift, you'd get to 3 o'clock in the morning and have no food to eat because the canteen was closed. And so surreptitiously we would eat chocolate bars off the production line. Okay? And eventually I got a dental abscess, but they had their own dentist on site, and so that was fine. And a few weeks after that, Lent was coming, and I decided for Lent I would give up sugar. So I did, and I learned then how much sugar is. All this, soups and ketchup and pretty well everything processed has sugar in it. And from that day to this, that's over 40 years, I never take sugar in my coffee or tea. I don't put sugar on my cereals. It really lowered my sugar tolerance. So actually it was a good thing I got the dental abscess. And I got the money together and I came to Canada, and then settled very happily out west in Alberta.